May 1st, 1982, approximately 1610 hours, the airspace north of West Falkland. Two Mirage III EA interceptors of Grupo 8 de Caza climb out from Rio Gallegos on the Argentine mainland, 300 miles behind them. In the lead aircraft, Captain Gustavo Garcia Cuerva. On his wing, Lieutenant Carlos Perona. Both men have trained for exactly this kind of intercept for years, against Chilean neighbors they half expected to fight, against a doctrine that has not changed in a generation. The doctrine is simple. A heat-seeking missile finds the exhaust of a jet engine. Turn to face it, present your nose instead of your tail, and the missile is blind. Every instructor either man has ever had told him the same thing. Get behind your enemy, or you are safe. Neither man knows that the two Sea Harriers closing on them from the south are carrying a missile built specifically to make that rule stop being true. Neither man will get the chance to test the doctrine on his own terms.
Within minutes, Garcia Cuerva's aircraft will be damaged by a missile fired from an angle his training told him was safe. Within the hour, he will be dead, and not from a British weapon. This is not a story about a dogfight over West Falkland. This is a story about a piece of American ordnance, matured over a decade of research on a Californian test range, meeting an Air Force that did not yet know its own rulebook had quietly gone out of date. This is the story of the AIM-9L Sidewinder, the missile behind Britain's 20-0 record in the only large-scale carrier air war fought since 1945, and the story of how long it took the men on the other end of it to understand exactly what had gone wrong. Part 1. The rule everyone had been taught. To understand what happened north of West Falkland on the 1st of May, you have to understand what Argentina's fighter pilots believed about infrared missiles, and why that belief was, on its own terms, entirely reasonable. Every version of the Sidewinder fielded since the 1950s had worked the same way. The seeker looked for the hottest thing in its field of view, which in practice meant the jet pipe of an aircraft in afterburner or full power. Approach from behind, inside a cone perhaps 30 degrees off the tailpipe, and the missile had a target. Approach from the side, or head-on, and the seeker saw nothing worth tracking. American combat data from Vietnam, where early Sidewinder variants were fired in real anger for the first time, had shown effective kill rates in the range of 10 to 15% of launches, almost entirely because pilots so rarely achieved a clean rear shot before the enemy maneuvered out of it. The lesson every Air Force drew from that decade was the same lesson. Control the merge, get behind the other aircraft, and a head-on pass is something you can fly through without dying. Argentina's Mirage III EAs, French-built and French-doctrined, absorbed that lesson as thoroughly as anyone in NATO. Its IAI Dagger fighter bombers, an Israeli-built derivative of the Mirage 5 flown by Grupo 6 de Caza, carried their own infrared missile, the Israeli Shafir II, built on the same rear aspect assumption. Its Skyhawk pilots, flying an aircraft 20 years old by 1982, had never been asked to think about the problem at all, because ground attack aircraft were not expected to dogfight in the first place. Across the whole of the Argentine order of battle, the working assumption was the one every serious Air Force held going into the 1970s. A head-on pass against another fighter is the pass you fly when you want to force a merge, not the pass that kills you. This was not a doctrine unique to Argentina, and it is worth being honest about that before the story turns against them. British, American, and Soviet pilots had all been taught some version of the same rule for the same reason. It had been true and provable for 25 years. Argentina's fighter pilots were not behind the times because their Air Force was careless. They were behind the times because the times, for once, had moved somewhere very specific and very recent, and the move had not yet been advertised to everyone flying against it. That assessment was not naive. It was based on the best available combat data anyone had. The problem was that it was roughly 5 years out of date, and the 5 years in question belonged to somebody else's Air Force. Part 2. The Lima. The missile that made the old rule obsolete had been built, in large part, to solve an argument inside the Pentagon, rather than a problem over the South Atlantic. In the early 1970s, the Defense Department's William Perry, then Deputy Director of Research and Engineering, ordered the U.S. Air Force to stop developing its own separate short-range missile and work instead with the U.S. Navy's Weapons Center at China Lake, California, to produce one common infrared missile for both services. The result, entering full production in 1977, was the AIM-9L. Inside the program, simply the Lima. Its seeker was the change that mattered. Where earlier Sidewinders used an uncooled detector that could only make sense of a strong, narrow heat source, like a jet pipe, the Lima's seeker was cooled and far more sensitive, with a wider field of view, able to pick up the weaker infrared signature of an airframe's skin friction and canopy heating, not only its engine. A pilot no longer needed the fuel, the patience, or the tactical advantage to work his way onto an opponent's tail. He needed only to point the seeker at the aircraft from almost any direction and let the guidance computer do the rest. West Germany's own missile house, Bodensee Gerätetechnik, had been developing a rival infrared seeker for a missile called Viper. Rather than fight that program for years, Raytheon and the U.S. Navy waived licensing fees and folded BGT into Lima production for the European allies, which is part of why the missile reached British as well as American squadrons so quickly. None of this engineering was visible from an Argentine cockpit. What was visible was that a shot taken from a direction that had always been safe no longer was. Put the two eras side by side. American combat analysis of the older Sidewinder marks in Vietnam gives an effective kill rate of roughly 10 to 15% of launches. Analysis of AIM-9L firings over the Falklands, by contrast, is commonly given at around 80%. Read that number again. 80%.
Not a better rocket motor, not a bigger warhead. The same size missile, the same basic airframe, finding its target 4 to 8 times more often because it no longer needed the one thing every air force in the world still assumed it needed: a clear shot from behind. Men on both sides of this story deserve to be remembered accurately, not as footnotes to a missile's technical specification sheet. Every like on this video keeps their names in front of a few more people. It costs nothing. It matters more than it should. Part 3. 19 missiles and a different kind of system. Britain very nearly did not have enough working examples of the Lima to prove any of this. When the task force sailed from Portsmouth on the 5th of April, 1982, official inventories show only 19 AIM-9Ls in the fleet's magazines, a peacetime stock built up in small numbers as the fleet air arm began converting from older Sidewinder marks, not a war reserve for a shooting conflict 8,000 miles away. What happened next is the part of the story that says more about two different kinds of air force than the missile itself does. The Ministry of Defense in London stripped a quantity of Limas from RAF Leuchars in Scotland, missiles earmarked for Britain's own NATO air defense commitment, and sent them south instead. Washington released roughly 100 more from active American stocks, flown out to Ascension Island in the mid-Atlantic to be waiting when HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible called there on the way south. It was an emergency transfer between two allies who had spent 30 years building the institutional habits, the liaison staffs, and the simple mutual trust required to move live war stock across an ocean in a matter of weeks. Argentina had no equivalent pipeline, because Argentina had built its air force by shopping rather than by alliance. Mirages from France, daggers and chiffriers from Israel, Skyhawks originally built for the U.S. Navy, bought secondhand. Each supplier had sold hardware without the shared doctrine, the shared intelligence picture, or the standing relationship that would have let Buenos Aires learn, in April rather than in combat, that a NATO partner's air force was quietly fielding a missile that broke the assumptions everyone's aircraft had been designed and flown against. The Lima's advantage was not only in its seeker head. It was in the fact that Britain had a friend able to hand it more of them on 3 weeks' notice, and Argentina had no one able to hand it a warning. If a relative of yours served in the Royal Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, or the Argentine Air Force during the South Atlantic conflict, I would be grateful to hear their name and unit in the comments. These stories are how the memory survives. Part 4. The afternoon of the 1st of May. The Sea Harrier's reputation,
and the end of Argentina's old doctrine were both settled inside a single afternoon. Late on the 1st of May, a pair of Sea Harriers from 801 Naval Air Squadron, flying from HMS Invincible, engaged Garcia Cuerva's and Perona's Mirages at medium altitude north of West Falkland. Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton fired an AIM-9L that struck Perona's aircraft directly. Perona ejected safely and was recovered by his own side days later. Barton's wingman, Lieutenant Steve Thomas, engaged Garcia Cuerva's Mirage and damaged it as the Argentine captain broke off and turned for cloud, his aircraft no longer able to make the 300-mile flight home to the mainland. Garcia Cuerva did what any pilot in his position would try. He turned instead for Puerto Argentino, the Argentine name for Stanley, then under Argentine occupation and, in theory, friendly ground. Argentine anti-aircraft gunners there, primed for a British strike and without a clear identification of the incoming aircraft, opened fire as it approached and shot it down over Port William. Garcia Cuerva was killed by the guns of his own side, having already survived a missile his training had told him was impossible to receive from that angle. Neither his body nor the wreckage of his Mirage was ever recovered. He was posthumously promoted and decorated for valor in combat. Elsewhere in the same engagement, Sea Harriers of 800 Naval Air Squadron, flying from HMS Hermes, met a pair of daggers armed with their Israeli Shafrirs. Flight Lieutenant Tony Penfold and Lieutenant Martin Hale turned to meet them. Penfold's Sidewinder found its mark, and the second dagger broke off for its own base. By the close of that single afternoon, 7 Argentine aircraft had gone down to Sea Harriers for no British losses, and the pattern that would define the rest of the war was already fixed. A subsonic, radarless jump jet was outkilling a delta-winged interceptor built to be faster and higher flying in almost every other respect. The heaviest fighting still lay ahead, once the landings opened at San Carlos Water on the 21st of May, and Argentine strike aircraft began flying repeated, low-level attacks against the ships anchored there. It was in this later phase that Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward, commanding officer of 801 Naval Air Squadron, brought down a dagger with his aircraft's own 30mm cannon rather than a missile, a reminder that the Lima, decisive as it was not the only weapon the Sea Harrier carried, and that a number of the war's closest engagements were fought at ranges too short for any missile, however capable its seeker, to be of any use at all. Part 5. The Verdict. By the time the fighting stopped in June, Sea Harriers had been credited with 20 confirmed air-to-air kills, 8 A-4 Skyhawks, 5 daggers, 4 Mirage IIIs, 3 Pucará attack aircraft caught in the open, the clear majority of them, by most tallies around 17 outright plus 2 shared, brought down by the Lima. Not one Sea Harrier or RAF Harrier GR. 3 was lost to an opposing fighter for the whole war. The aircraft that were lost went down to ground fire, to a shoulder-launched missile, or to accident. So why could an experienced, professionally trained Air Force not explain, in real time, what was killing its pilots from angles they had been taught were safe? Not because Argentina's airmen were poor pilots. Garcia Cuerva and Perona flew a demanding intercept exactly as they had been trained to fly it. Part of the answer is that they were flying it blind, in more ways than one. Years after the war, an American Air Force officer asked Captain Pablo Carballo, one of Argentina's most experienced Skyhawk pilots, what it felt like when his radar warning receiver lit up to show a missile inbound. Carballo's answer was direct. We didn't really feel anything, because our planes had no radar warning receiver. Argentina's fighter bombers went to war unable even to register that the rules had already changed against them. The wider explanation is structural. Argentina's Air Force had been assembled from 3 separate foreign suppliers, with 3 separate doctrines, and no shared warning channel, fighting an opponent whose closest ally could locate and airlift 100 missiles across an ocean inside the span of a single deployment. The Lima did not need to be a better dogfighting missile than anything Argentina carried. It needed only to arrive from a direction nobody on the other side had been told to watch. The human cost of that gap fell heaviest on individual men rather than on doctrine. Garcia Cuerva died on the ground, at his own country's hands, minutes after surviving the missile that should have killed him in the air. Perona lived and flew again.
Whatever verdict this story reaches about missiles and alliances, that particular irony belongs to no doctrine at all. It belongs to a gun crew at Puerto Argentino who could not tell a wounded friend from an incoming enemy in the last light of a South Atlantic afternoon. The Lima did not stay a South Atlantic story for long. Air forces across NATO studied its Falklands record closely, because it was the first time an all-aspect infrared missile had been proven at scale against real opposing pilots rather than instrumented ranges, and the result fed directly into its successor, the AIM-9M, refined specifically for the same head-on, close-in fight the Falklands had just demonstrated in earnest. The old doctrine, stay out of his 6 o'clock and you are safe, did not simply fail one air force on one afternoon. It stopped being true for everyone, and Argentina's pilots were simply the first to find that out without being told. A note on the record before this ends. Individual timings for the engagements of the 1st of May vary by a few minutes between British and Argentine accounts, and the precise number of AIM-9Ls eventually transferred from American stocks is given differently across sources, commonly between 1 and 200 rounds. The exact circumstances of Garcia Cuerva's death carry the same small uncertainty that follows most wartime friendly fire losses. Some accounts describe him diverting toward Puerto Argentino before the anti-aircraft fire found him. Others simply place the guns and the aircraft together over Port William in the same few minutes. What is not in dispute, across every account checked for this script, is that he survived a British missile and did not survive his own side's guns. Every named pilot, unit, and outcome in this account, Barton and Perona, Thomas and Garcia Cuerva, Penfold and Hale, is drawn from multiple independent accounts of that day and is consistent on the essential facts across the sources checked. Where sources disagree on a detail too small to change the outcome, this script has said so, rather than quietly picking the tidier version of events and moving on without comment, because that particular habit is exactly how small errors get repeated for 40 long years. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these, more missiles that arrived faster than a warning could, more pilots who did everything their training told them to do, and more names, on every side of every conflict in this series, that should not be allowed to quietly disappear from the record.